Welcome to the Thomistic Institute podcast. Our mission is to promote the Catholic intellectual tradition in the university, the church, and the wider public square. The lectures on this podcast are organized by university students at Thomistic Institute chapters around the world. To learn more and to attend these events, visit us at thomisticinstitute.org.
Students around the world are asking questions about God, the truth, and the meaning of their lives. Your gift will put top-notch Catholic intellectuals in front of students who are seeking. Go to thomisticinstitute.org/support-students to transform a student's life today. That's thomisticinstitute.org/support-students.
So the topic, how to do business and keep your soul. I'm going to take from a Catholic perspective because that's my background and expertise, but I'm hoping a lot of what I have to say will be very generally applicable. And I'll try to keep my comments relatively brief so then we have time for discussion afterwards, so we can kind of apply to different situations if you like. The general theme I want to start out with is the solution to the question of how to be successful in business and still keep your soul is a very faith-forward solution. So if you believe in a soul and you have some kind of religious background to that or perspective, then that's where you want to begin. So if you're a praying person, you should be praying a lot. Right? That's a key part. You should be engaging heavily in the practices of your religious faith. So from a Catholic perspective, you go to Mass every week, ideally every day. You go to confession every month, ideally every week. You go to adoration, spend an hour in front of the Blessed Sacrament. All of these things, I think, are necessary if you want to kind of to keep your soul, as we phrased it. You can then go deeper, depending on whatever religious tradition. Within Catholicism, we have something called Catholic Social Teaching, which is a series of principles for applying faith or faith perspective to business and economics. There are four that we put at the center of the business that we teach at the Busch School, where I am dean, and there are four common principles within Catholic Social Teaching. The principle of human dignity, so understanding the dignity of every human person. So you're in business. You keep reminding yourself that your customers, your employees, your suppliers, your shareholders, these are all human beings. They all have human dignity. Everything you do or nothing you do should violate that human dignity. So that's the first principle. The second principle is the principle of solidarity, which follows from the principle of human dignity that we are all responsible for each other. So yes, you're in business to make a profit, but you keep in mind that you are actually in there to try to help your customer, to serve your customer. That's the ultimate goal. If you're not profitable, then you're not a business. Then you're just another organization that needs funding. Business is the only human organization that funds itself, right? The third principle is the principle of subsidiarity, which says that one of the important ways to honor the dignity of another human being is to allow them to make their own decisions. So the principle of subsidiarity said that decisions should be made as close to the point of impact as possible. So within a corporation, that typically translates to delegation of authority, for example. It has also political implications. And then the last one is the principle of the common good, which is to always be recognizing that everything we do ought to be for the purpose of so we could spend lots and lots of time talking about each of these principles, exploring them, their applications, and so on. And I'm happy to do that in the Q&A part. But I want to go a step beyond that. So I've had the privilege of teaching business now for 21 years. I was the founding dean of our business school 10 years ago. And so this question of how does one live as a person of faith in business is something that I have been thinking about for a long, long time. But what I have realized is that there's another question beyond these various principles that I've been talking about, and that is, having done everything that I've talked about in terms of praying and sacraments and following principles and so on, how do you, in the moment, practice business so as not to lose your soul? Kind of speaking, maybe poetically, if you will, but how do you practice business as a good person, if you will? If it's kind of a different way of putting it. Are you praying all the time while you're doing business? Are you constantly trying to filter everything you do in business through these various principles that we've talked about? It's a lot of work, and it's difficult if you had to do it that way. Is there an easier way? And I think there is. But let me introduce this with an analogy. Imagine that suddenly our entire society lost our habits of walking and talking. We didn't lose the muscles that are necessary for walking and talking. We didn't even lose the knowledge of how to talk or how to walk. But we didn't have either of those as habits. So that every time I needed to take a step, I would have to consciously go, okay, lift up my right leg, bend the knee, swing my leg forward, lean forward. How much more difficult life would be? I mean, it would be very difficult, right? So things would happen very, very slowly because I'd have to be thinking through every single step. We obviously haven't lost, I certainly haven't lost the ability to talk and walk, or the habits to do that, but we have lost another set of habits almost as important to our society, to our human life. And these are habits for making decisions, for interacting with others, and for dealing with our feelings. Okay? And if you think about it, making decisions, interacting with others, dealing with our feelings are pretty much all we do all day, every day. So that's a pretty serious loss to have. If we don't have good habits for making decisions, we take too long to make decisions, or we never make them, or we make them poorly. If we don't have good habits for interacting with others, we get surprise, a divided country, and an inability for people to talk to others with whom they disagree with, fewer people making lifelong commitments, getting married, and so on. If we have difficulty managing, or we don't have good habits for managing our feelings, we have an epidemic of anxiety and of depression, which is what we do have. So what are these habits? Anybody see where I'm going with this? Perhaps you are. Right? I'm talking about the ancient tradition of virtue, the virtue. So a virtue is technically defined as a good habit that makes you good. But let's just focus on a good habit. Right? So a vice is a bad habit, a virtue is a good habit. Everything you know about habits applies to virtues, about good habits. Have any of you heard of or read a book called Atomic Habits? I recommend it. It's a good book. And there's actually several others. There's almost a sort of a enthusiasm, I would say, for books about habits. The idea being anything you can make habitual gets easier. Anything you can make into a habit gets easier. The problem with the word virtue is it means so many different things to so many different people now. And I bet you that in many cases, people have heard it more often in the phrase virtue signaling than by itself, right? And so it sort of sounds like a baddish thing. It's like a thing you do to show off, you know. I am absolutely not talking about that kind. If you understand virtue as that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about virtues as good habits, okay? Now, they're not just any habit. They are like every other habit in that anyone can acquire them. So virtues are not genetic. They are habits that anybody can acquire through practice. And just like any habit, you do something a little bit every day, it becomes a habit, it gets easier, and so on. But there's something distinctive about virtues different from every other habit. So, for example, brushing your teeth is a habit, right? So if you have a habit of brushing your teeth, is not a virtue. It's a good habit, but it's not a virtue. So not all good habits are virtues, but all virtues are good habits. That makes sense. Okay, good. Virtues are kind of like superpowers, okay? Because they make it easy for you to do really important and valuable things. So, for example, courage is a virtue. Right? Courage is the habit of doing the right thing even though you're afraid. It's not a habit of not being afraid. That would be hard to do and probably unhealthy, psychologically speaking. Fears come, and then when they come, courage means accepting them and then just moving forward. Okay? So, but that is a habit that anybody can acquire through practice. There are three things about these superpowers. The first is, so three ways in which virtues are different from every other habit. The first is that virtues have a much wider scope than other habits. So the habit of brushing your teeth, I mentioned before, if you get in the habit of brushing your teeth, it's good for brushing your teeth, right? But if you learn to be courageous on the football field, you can use that courage in an interview or in a riot or in a, wherever you need it. So they have kind of wider applicability. That's the first thing. The second thing about virtues versus every other kind of habit, is they make you happier. So Aristotle told us this thousands of years ago, but contemporary psychology has given us empirical evidence for this, that as people grow in a particular virtue, they tend to be happier. The third thing is you also tend to get healthier. So I'll give you an example from psychology. People study, for example, gratitude as a virtue. And you can help somebody grow in gratitude by having them keep a gratitude journal. Every day you write down things you are grateful for. And over time, you grow in gratitude. It's very effective. When psychologists do these kinds of studies, and they have a control group who are not doing virtue diary or doing some other activity unrelated to gratitude, versus another group doing this gratitude diary, they will find over time that the folks doing the gratitude diary report being happier, and they also report a decline in various chronic diseases. Back problems, for example, they get better. Depression incidences go down. So there's something very special happening as you grow in any one of these good habits that we call virtues. The other thing I think that often gets confused about virtue is people think of it as meaning generic goodness. When you talk about somebody being virtuous, it means they're just a good person, right? But we're meaning something much more precise here. For example, people often conflate virtues and values, right? They both begin with V, they both mean kind of being good, so having values, being virtuous. Here's the distinction, and I think it's a very important one. So values are having kind of the ideas or principles you live by. Virtues are making those values into habits of action, right? So if you like, values are talking the talk, virtues are walking the walk. That's a huge difference, because at the risk of being trite, even the Nazis had values, right? We can question how good those values were. So you see the distinction. Okay, good. They talked about growing in virtue through practice. The opposite of a virtue I mentioned before is a vice or a bad habit. In terms of growing from a vice to a virtue, so how do you go from, if you have a vice and you want to get rid of it and you want to make it the opposite virtue, how do you do that? The ancients differentiated 4 stages. So you had vice as the kind of the one extreme and virtue as the other, but you don't go from just one to the other. There are 2 intermediate stages. Those intermediate stages have in English the unfortunate name of continence and incontinence, which nowadays tends to mean bladder control or lack thereof. So I prefer to use a 4-part framework that has been around for a few decades in the management training field, where you go from what is called unconscious incompetence. So you're not good at something, and you don't even know. So the vice of ingratitude, for example, would be here. You're just a very ungrateful person, and you're not even aware of any sense of obligation, saying thank you, whatever, or being grateful. The next step then becomes conscious incompetence. So I now, either by reading or because mentorship or friends say, you know what, you should be more grateful. I've received many things, you should show some more gratitude. So that's conscious incompetence. The next step is then conscious competence. So through practice, you start to develop this virtue. So you say virtue diary, or you're practicing expressing gratitude to people who do good things to you. That's still not virtue. Virtue is unconscious, or equivalent to unconscious competence. So it's become habitual. So you're now a grateful person, and it's a habit of yours. It hardly takes any effort. The beauty of this approach is it allows you to become really good at many, many things without being overwhelmed. Right? Because as you develop each habit, you can then move on to the next habit, grow in another habit, grow in another virtue, and have a whole range of virtues that you would display. and you'll be a very happy and very popular person because you'll be doing nice things for everybody, right? So okay, so far so good. Here's a big question. Which good habits are virtues? So I mentioned, they tend to be widely applicable or have broad scope. They tend to make you happier, make you healthier. How many virtues are there? Can any positive abstract noun be a virtue? Harmony, prosperity, serenity, unity, integrity, are these virtues? Not in the classical sense, okay? But this can be confusing. If you go to the library and find a book about virtue, and there are many, you'll find lists of 15, 20, 30, 60, 90 beautifully written chapters about different virtues. And the problem is the different books will sometimes have some overlap, but rarely will they have. I've never seen total overlap. So you read these books and you think, okay, so here's 30, 60, 90 ways in which I need to improve. And it can get a little bit stressful, right? So where should I start? Where should I go? What I think we need is not just a list of virtues, but a way to show how they all fit together, some kind of systematic treatment, right? Some kind of system of virtues. Give you an analogy. So I like to sail. Sailing is my hobby. And I've had a series of small boats through the years. And then just this past spring, I bought what used to be called a mid-sized boat. It's 30 feet long. Now they call it a small boat. Boats are so big. So a small 30-foot sailing boat, which as a professor, all I can afford is a very old 30-foot sailing boat. And so I had to quickly learn how to deal with the diesel engine on an old boat, 30-year-old diesel engine. And so I went online and I looked up the make and model of the engine that I had to try to learn more about it. And the first thing I found was a list of parts, showing me where I can buy these replacement parts if I need to for this engine. But then next I found a diagram of the engine showing how all the parts, listing the parts and showing how they all fit together. Which do you think was more useful for me in trying to maintain this engine? Of course, the diagram, right, showing how everything fits together rather than just a list of parts. And that's what I think is often missing in discussions about virtues. We give lists of virtues, but we don't show how the whole thing fits together. The one exception here is our friend Thomas Aquinas. So the Thomistic Institute, they're built around the philosophy and theology of Thomas Aquinas. During the shutdowns in COVID, so I have about a 2-hour commute there and back from Virginia into Washington, D.C. to my school. So I had a gift of 2 hours a day, more time than I would normally when we were all locked down. So I decided to do what any good business dean should do, and I reread the section of Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica on virtue. It was fascinating. And something kind of clicked in reading this that showed what a systematic treatment he made of virtue. And the best way I can explain this is, so Autumn mentioned that prior to my academic career, I spent a number of years as a management consultant with McKinsey & Company. Among the students, any of you have aspirations to go into consulting? We have one. All right. Okay. So listen closely. This is going to be helpful. One of the things they teach you as a young management consultant is how to break apart a business problem. How to take a problem, or really any problem, and break it into its component parts. It's a sort of mechanistic approach, but it's very helpful. And what they do is they take each problem and kind of distinguish its component parts, and then take a component part and further break it apart and so on. And the important thing is at every point of distinction, every separation, you have to ensure that you are, and they use an acronym, they use MECD, which stands for mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. In other words, the parts, as you break the problem into its component parts, there should be no overlap, so mutually exclusive, and no gaps, so collectively exhaustive. Okay, so you break apart the problem into many different pieces, and then as a consultant, you divide it up, and you each go do a different piece, and then you know when it rolls up together, it will all add up, and nothing will be missing, and nothing will be duplicated. So as I'm reading through Aquinas' treatise on the virtues, I realized what he did was a MECD analysis of all of human life. Okay, so here's what he does. He starts with a human life, and he starts making these distinctions. And he said, okay, first, we can distinguish between the natural and the supernatural parts of life, right? And then he says, okay, for the supernatural parts of life, we have a bunch of virtues. Faith, hope, and love, or faith, hope, and charity, which are called the theological virtues. Good. Then he says, okay, now let's look at the natural part of life, and let's distinguish there between intellectual life and practical life. Intellectual life being thought for thought's sake, the kind of things we do in universities, and then practical life is everything else, okay? So, and for the intellectual life, there are a series of virtues as well. Where it really got interesting for me is the practical life part of it. Where he says, look, all of our practical life, remember I began the lecture by talking about we've lost the habits of making decisions, interacting with others, dealing with our feelings. That's a three-part distinction he makes. Loosely speaking, he talks about intellect, will, and passion. So the philosophers in the room, you may have heard about this, but it's not a big leap to say that's really what we're talking about is making decisions, right? Dealing with others, dealing with our feelings. And then he took the feelings part and he said, let's distinguish those into two kinds or two sets of emotions. The kinds of emotions that attract us to things, our desires, and the kinds of emotions that repel us from things, which would be our fears. So now you have decisions, interactions, fears, thoughts, fears, desires. And so he gives a big virtue for each of those. And those four big virtues, if you've heard of in the classical tradition, the cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, line up with making decisions, interacting with others, dealing with your fears, dealing with desires. So prudence is the virtue, the habit of making wise decisions. And so if you have a habit of making wise decisions, then you've got decision-making down pat, right? Justice is the habit of treating others fairly. Right? So if you have the habit of justice, then you've got your interactions with others that are going to be on a very solid footing. Courage, fortitude, I mentioned before, the habit of doing the right thing even though you're afraid. That's how you deal with your fears, right? And then temperance or self-discipline, the habit of only giving into your desires when it makes sense to do. When your desires are going to lead you towards something that you think you should be doing. So if you had these four virtues, right, prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, you can be an excellent human being. Right? You are not going to struggle to make good decisions. You're not going to struggle to interact with others fairly. You're not going to be crushed by your fears, and you're not going to be slave to your desires. Right? You're just going to be a very balanced, effective, and happy human being. Now, each of those four is a heavy lift. Right? You can't grow in courage in 7 days. Right? It takes a lot of effort. So then Thomas does one more thing. He notices how each one of these virtues has a bunch of different names, but they're sort of related virtues. You could almost think of them as component virtues that are smaller parts of that are more accessible. So, for example, the virtue of restraint, which is the habit of not giving in to every single kind of instinct or desire that you have, particularly petty desires. That's something that we can all start learning kind of right away. So I'm on Amazon, I immediately want to buy something. I decide to count to 10, and I try to get in the habit of counting to 10 before hitting buy. All right, that becomes a habit. Then I can start counting to 20, and then to 50, and then before you know it, you've got time to really develop the habit of restraint. So let me show you a picture of this. Collectively, let's hand these out. So this is my attempt, if you could, thank you so much, my attempt to visualize that Misi analysis of all of human life broken out into virtues. When you first see it, feel free to gasp, not at its beauty, but at its complexity. There's a lot of stuff going on that page, but we'll spend a minute or two going through it, and I think you'll see where I'm going with it. As you hand those out, you can. One analogy that I find helpful is to think of the set of virtues, that the system of virtues that Thomas is describing, as a human operating system. If you think about your phone's operating system, what happens if you don't update it? Phone doesn't work so well, right? You get hacked more easily and so on. these virtues are kind of like the underlying human operating system. They sit underneath our various skills and allow us to be kind of good, functioning and flourishing human beings. Okay, does everyone have a copy? Great. So, the medievals would draw, maybe some of you have seen pictures, a tree of virtues, where they'd have branches and then these sub-virtues would grow off from the branches. I'm taking a different approach here. Imagine instead this is a cross-section of a tree trunk. So the rings are like the rings of a tree. You need a picture. Do you have any extras? We have enough. Nobody has to double up here. So yeah, anybody needs more, just raise their hands. Okay, good. So start in the center of the diagram where it says human life. So the 360 degrees there, that represents all of human life. Each ring is a further distinction. So the first distinction is on that the first golden ring there, distinguishing between material life and spiritual life. So the spiritual life, I mentioned, faith, hope, and charity, or faith, hope, and love are the virtues of the spiritual life. And so that little slice of cake, if you will, is now out of our picture for now. For the purposes of discussion, the remaining part of the ring that says material life is now divided in the next ring, the gray ring, between practical and intellectual life. Do you all see this? Do you see how the division? Okay, good. And so the intellectual life has science, art, wisdom, and understanding as the intellectual virtues. I'm going to set those aside. I want us to focus on the practical life virtues. And so now we have the feelings, decisions, and interactions on the white ring, the next ring out. And then the feelings ring, the feelings one is further subdivided into desires and fears. So let's take a smaller one first. Let's look at the fears one, where you've got the virtue of courage. So Aquinas says, properly speaking, that true courage is for the danger when you're facing fear of death. So deadly dangers. So a firefighter or a soldier or a mom about to give birth, somebody who's running a risk of dying in what they're doing, that's true courage. But then he says there are other things that are kind of like courage that you can grow in them, and then they're going to help you grow in courage itself. So to look at the Misi kind of distinctions he's making here. So in all other cases, challenging situations that are not deadly, he says we can divide them into two kinds. Challenges that have to be endured. Do you all see this on the little greenish part? Yeah? Okay. Challenges that have to be endured because they can't be overcome, such as maybe a chronic illness that you have. Like it doesn't matter how courageous you are, you're stuck with the illness, you have to endure it. And then there are other challenges that can actually be overcome. For enduring challenges, he makes a further distinction between physical challenges and mental ones. So physical would be the virtue of perseverance. So that's the habit of going on, doing what you're supposed to do, even though you are tired or ill, or somehow physically limited in what you want to do. And then for mental challenges, the virtue of resilience. So that's the ability to go, the habit of continuing to go on, even though you may not feel like it, or you may be depressed, you may be anxious. Sometimes if you're suffering from clinical depression, merely getting out of bed in the morning, right, is beginning to practice the habit of resilience, merely kind of taking that first step. And then for overcoming challenges, he makes a very practical distinction. He says there are two kind of ways of overcoming challenges. One by hard work, the other by spending lots of money. And so magnanimity is overcoming a challenge through hard work. Munificence is overcoming a challenge by spending lots of money. And so those are four virtues that are related to the virtue of of courage, that any one of us could begin practicing any one of those. And as you grow in that one, it then makes it easier for you to grow in the ones adjacent to it and to courage itself. Okay, so when I say anybody can do any of these things, this circle, because of the way Aquinas makes these distinctions in this sort of Misi fashion, the reason I drew it as a circle is there are no gaps in between these. So collectively there are 50 virtues on this diagram, in case you didn't have time to count them. But these 50, in a sense, represent an entire life. So they're kind of a roadmap for a flourishing human life. I'll give you a couple of other examples. The self-discipline one is very broad. That's the sort of greenish one at the top right quadrant. So he divides into mental desires and physical desires. The physical, he says, are our strongest because those are the ones that, particularly for nourishment and reproduction, are the ones that keep the human race going. Right? So if we don't eat, we die. If we don't reproduce, the human race dies out. And so he says it's no surprise that our desires would be strongest in those areas. And then there are associated virtues with each of those. I did a little cheat and I added virtues, the desires for physical stuff. Because I think in our society today, it's such a strongly consumerist society, the desire for things is almost as powerful as the desire for sex or for food. And so I kind of added those in there alongside the others. The mental desires, this I find is a really useful framework. So the first division, if you look at the mental desires, there's desires about the external world and then desires about yourself. About the external world, he says we can have desires to do things, to know things, or to be in control of things. To do things, I mentioned already, desire to do petty things. You have the virtue of restraint for dealing with that. So if you tend to give in to whims and waste a lot of time and get into trouble because you give in to a lot of whims, then the virtue of restraint is a good one to practice. But then next to that, related to that, is the desire to do great things. And you would say, well, what's wrong with the desire to do great things? Why would you want to check that desire in any way? And the answer there is that if you try to do things that are well beyond your capacity, then you're going to waste your time and possibly get into trouble, waste other people's time. And so the virtue of humility is what you're looking for there, which is the habit of having a right understanding of your own ability. So humility, according to Thomas and the ancients, is not belittling yourself in any way. It's just having an accurate assessment of yourself, neither thinking too much of yourself, neither thinking too little, and so on. Let me just highlight a couple of others. But actually, one thing I want to point out with respect to desires here, Thomas is very clear on this. The purpose of a virtue is not to squish the desire. It's to channel the desire into productive directions. So, for example, the virtue of diligence, the next one over, the desire to know. So the virtue of diligence, the best way to foster the virtue of diligence, this is beautiful, according to Thomas, but also according to the contemporary studies we see in psychology and education, is not study hard and force yourself to study even harder and just kind of whip yourself into discipline yourself. It's to fall in love with your subject, right? So in other words, channel your desire to know into more productive directions. And so the problem, say, with social media, amongst other things, is that you waste that precious desire to know on things that aren't really worth knowing, because you're going to forget them a moment later. Instead, if you use that desire to know and you focus it on your studies, say, it's much more productive and would have longer term benefits for you and for society. Okay. So I could go on forever with this, as you can probably tell, that I love to geek out on virtue. So what I'm going to do is just give you another handout. This is more of a takeaway handout, and then I'm happy to take questions. What I have here is, it's in draft, so please don't cite it, and not perfect, but it is describing the 4 levels for each of the 50 virtues. So what might it look like to be unconsciously incompetent with respect to each of them, and then consciously, and so on, all 4. The last thing I will share is to point out on the at the bottom of the diagram, the anatomy diagram, there's a URL, and if you don't feel like typing that whole thing in, you can just search for Busch Virtue Diagnostic, and you'll find an electronic version. It's not of this diagram, but it's of the same logic. So you can kind of go through and this or that until you land on a virtue that you would like to practice. And at the end, and for each virtue, it gives you several pages of definition, summary of the empirical research, case examples of people displaying that virtue, and suggestions for things you could practice. So, for example, if you wanted to grow in resilience, one of the most interesting exercises I've come across that I recommend is, and you may have seen this, was a TED talk some time ago. Set yourself the challenge of, for 30 days, each day asking somebody a question where you know you're going to get a refusal. To go to a store and ask them if they carry a brand of clothing that you know they don't carry. Or go to a professor and ask for an extension when the professor's already said no extensions. Just like force yourself to be in a situation where you ask for something and you know it will be denied for 30 days. Most of us hate being told no. Right? We've never put ourselves in a situation where we'd be told no. But you do that for 30 days and you realize, no, it doesn't kill me, Now you're slightly more resilient. You've started to grow in the virtue of resilience. Okay? Good. The last thing I'll tell you before I take questions is you already have all 50 of these virtues at some level. Unlikely that you are vicious, unconsciously incompetent. Most of us are somewhere between conscious competence and incompetence. Think of them not as kind of optional strengths that you might acquire, but as wheels on a bus. You all have these 50 wheels. Some of the tires just aren't as inflated as others, okay? And a flourishing life for you is get pumping. And one wheel at a time, right? Pick one and say, okay, I think I would be happier. A usual way with our students we find to pick one is, what part of your life is bothering you most right now? What causes you most grief? What causes you most upset? Find the virtue that would fix that. And then begin practicing something little until it gets easy, and then add a bit more, practice some more, and you'll be surprised in a matter of days, weeks. It becomes a habit. My goal with our students is that at the end of their 4 years, they've done this a few times, and so they're now convinced that, hey, I can do this for the rest of these. The rest of my life can be a continuous journey in terms of growth in virtue.
Thanks for listening to this lecture on the Thomistic Institute podcast. The generosity of people like you makes this podcast possible. If you enjoy these talks, please consider showing your support at www.thomisticinstitute.org/donate. Your donation of even $1 helps us reach more college students and many others with the powerful truths of the faith, and it ensures that we can keep publishing top-notch lectures on this podcast. Thanks a lot.